In the spring of 1980, 6 armed individuals marched into the Iranian Embassy in South Kensington, London, England, where they took 26 people hostage, including visitors, staff, and even a police officer. Over the course of 5 days, the group of gunmen made various demands, but progress was slow, and British officials were more interested in negotiating for the safe return of the hostages. On day 6, following the death of a hostage, the SAS conducted a raid, killing all but one of the gunmen. This siege not only thrust the SAS into the spotlight, but also served to strengthen the UK government and the careers of several journalists who'd been caught in the crosshairs. This is the tale of the Iranian Embassy siege in London. Welcome to Wars of the World. The 6 men who planned and carried out the Iranian Embassy siege were all members of the Democratic Revolutionary Front of the Liberation of Arabistan, a militant group headed by Arab nationalist Owen Ali Mohammed. The aim of the DRFLA, which operated between 1979 and 1980, was to gain independence for the Khuzestan province in Iran, an oil-rich area that provided the country with much of its wealth. The group emerged following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which saw the overthrowing of the country's monarchy and was backed by Iraq, led at the time by Saddam Hussein. According to DRFLA leader Owen Ali Mohammed, the attack on the embassy was prompted by the quashing of their identity by those in power in Iran, the Shahs. In a tape recording heard by the BBC, one of the men involved stated that he joined the revolution in the hopes that new leadership would, quote, give them the freedom which had been stolen by the Shah and his father, end quote. However, he realized that once they were in power, the new leaders forgot all their promises to the people. Furthermore, the plot was inspired by a similar event in Tehran, in which staff and visitors were taken hostage at the US Embassy. Owen Ali Mohammed was just 27 at the time of the Iranian Embassy siege. He had been politically active since his time at university, and claimed to have scars where he'd been imprisoned and tortured by the Shah's secret police, SAVAK. The other men involved in the assault were Shakir Abdullah Radhil, Mohammed's second-in-command, and 4 gunmen, Maki Hanoun, Thamir Muhammad Hussein, Shakir Sultan Saeed, and Fauzi Badavi Najad, who was just 22 years old and the only one who had survived the plot. Using an Iraqi passport, Mohammed arrived in London on March 31st, 1980, accompanied by 3 of the other men. Their first order of business was to find somewhere to stay while they prepared for the assault, and they ultimately began renting a flat in Earl's Court, West London. Over the next few days, as many as 12 men visited the home, coming and going at all hours of the day. On April 30th, the group informed their landlord that they would be out of town for a week visiting Bristol, and that upon their return they would be leaving again for Iraq, and thus they no longer needed the flat. The last time they were at the home in Earl's Court was that morning. They left at 9:30 AM and subsequently went to arm themselves with pistols, grenades, and submachine guns with ammo. Though it's unclear where the weapons were collected, it's been suggested that the Soviet-made firearms had been smuggled in through an Iraqi diplomatic bag, with a 2014 academic study later concluding that the men responsible for the embassy siege had been recruited and trained by the Iraqi government, who were backing numerous separatist movements in the lead-up to the Iran-Iraq war. The group of 6 made it to the Iranian embassy just before 11:30 that same day. At 11:30 AM, the 6 gunmen stormed into the embassy building on Prince's Gate in South Kensington. A lone police constable, Trevor Locke, who was on duty and guarding the embassy, had been carrying a revolver, but he was quickly overpowered before he was able to draw the weapon. A frisk of the PC by one of the gunmen revealed nothing of note. They didn't find his revolver. Locke subsequently refused to eat or drink, or to remove his coat, in fear of the men seeing the weapon. He told them that he would prefer to keep his jacket on in order to preserve his image as a police officer. 26 hostages were taken in total during the siege, meaning that all but 3 people in the embassy were caught. Those who escaped managed to do so by either climbing out of a ground floor window or by climbing across a railing on the first floor to the neighbouring Ethiopian embassy. Those who had been captured were mostly Iranian nationals, as well as British employees of the embassy. But there were also several journalists present, including Mustafa Karkuti, a Syrian who'd been residing in London since 1970. Karkuti was preparing to interview the cultural attaché when the gunman entered the building. Also present was journalist Mohammed Hashir Farouki, who was there to interview another Iranian official, and Sim Harris and Chris Kramer, both BBC employees who were seeking to obtain visas to visit Iran in the aftermath of the revolution. British police arrived on the scene shortly after they had received reports of gunfire, and 10 minutes later they were joined by members of the Metropolitan Police's Diplomatic Protection Group, often shortened to DPG. Notably, this is the same group that PC Trevor Locke was working for. Initially, the police went to encircle the building, but they quickly dispersed when one of the hostage takers appeared at the window and then threatened to open fire. Around half an hour later, Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Dello arrived on the scene. As the senior officer, he took charge of the operation, eventually establishing a police base inside a nursery school further down the road. Soon the Specialist Firearms Command were brought in to assist, as well as officers who specialized in surveillance. Meanwhile, Chief Inspector Max Vernon arrived to lead the hostage negotiations, assisted by a psychiatrist and another negotiator. Notably, Vernon had previously been credited with successfully negotiating during the 1975 Balcombe Street siege, in which the IRA spent 6 days holding a middle-aged couple hostage in a standoff with the Metropolitan Police. The police were eventually able to give the gunmen a field telephone, which they could use to communicate their demands, and at 3:15 PM, Owen Mohammed made the group's first demand. They wished to see the release of 91 Arabs who were being held in prisons in Khuzestan. The group also gave a tight time limit, ordering that the prisoners be released by noon the following day. They claimed that if their demands were not followed, they would blow up the embassy and kill all 26 hostages and themselves inside. Before long, journalists arrived on the scene to report on the story, while Iranian protesters also emerged, remaining near the embassy throughout the entire ordeal and sometimes getting into altercations with the police. In order to keep control of the situation, the British government's emergency committee, known as COBRA, short for the Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms, gathered to discuss the situation. As UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was unavailable, the meeting was led by Home Secretary William Whitelaw and involved numerous prominent officials like expert advisors and government ministers. Though the Iranian government were notified of the event, they reportedly accused both the US and UK governments of backing the siege, claiming that it was retaliation for the siege occurring at the US Embassy in Tehran. Later that same day at 4:30 PM, the gunman released a hostage named Frida Mozaffarian. By all accounts, she'd been unwell since the attack began, and though Mohammed had requested that a doctor be sent to the embassy to treat her, the police had refused. Mohammed was soon deceived by the other hostages, who told him that Frida was pregnant, and she was ultimately released as her illness grew worse. The following day, on May 1st, 2 teams from the Special Air Services, or SAS, arrived in London from Hereford. Prior to the May 1980 siege, the activities of the SAS were very much unknown to civilians, and they seemed more like a mythical and undefined unit of the military than anything else. In fact, the SAS had been established during the Second World War to carry out more unconventional campaigns compared to the regular troops. Similar military units were set up by other European governments following the 1972 Munich massacre, with the Germans establishing the GSG-9 and the French the GIGN. After this massacre, the UK government also created a separate unit within the SAS, the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare, which was tasked with anti-terrorism and anti-hijacking operations. The SAS were well equipped to handle the Iranian Embassy siege, They had tear gas, stun grenades, submachine guns and explosives at their disposal. And in the early hours of May 1st, one of the teams was moved into one of the neighbouring buildings at 14 Prince's Gate, normally the head office of the Royal College of General Practitioners. Later that same morning, one of the hostages was instructed to call the BBC's news desk, though Mohammed would shortly thereafter take the phone and speak directly with the journalist on the other end of the line. Mohammed claimed that the non-Iranian hostages would not be harmed, and explained that he and his men were part of the DR-FLA. However, when the journalist asked to speak with the hostages, he refused and the call was ended. After discovering what had happened, the police opted to cut the phone lines to and from the building, as well as the telex system, leaving the gunman with the only option of using the military phone. The phone was used later that morning by journalist Sim Harris, who was told to ask the police for a doctor. This was because his colleague Chris Kramer was seemingly very unwell. It would later come to light that Kramer was upping the severity of his symptoms in an attempt to get the gunman to release some of the hostages. However, the police negotiator refused to allow a doctor inside the building and told Sim Harris that he should persuade the group to let Kramer go. The group, however, were very hesitant, and most of the morning was taken up by negotiations, with the gunman eventually releasing Kramer at around 11:15 AM. Though Kramer had played up the severity of his symptoms, he was unwell and was subsequently taken to the hospital. Over the next 45 minutes, the police spoke again with Mohammed. They were acutely aware that the 12 noon deadline from the day before was swiftly approaching, and though they did not believe that the men had the means of blowing up the entire building, they persuaded Mohammed nonetheless to change his deadline to 2 PM. Following this, and after being able to speak with Kramer, the authorities decided that they would let the deadline pass, and it did so quietly. No word came from the DR-FLA group until later that afternoon, when Mohammed demanded that the British media broadcast a statement which would discuss their issues with officials in Iran, and that they would be granted safe passage from the UK afterwards. That evening, however, tensions rose within the embassy, when Mohammed noticed noises coming from the neighbouring Ethiopian embassy. When he demanded that PC Locke identify the noise, Locke told him that it was mice scurrying about within the building's old walls. In actual fact, technicians were drilling holes in the walls so that they could install listening devices. To try and ease Mohammed's suspicions, the government ordered that British Gas begin drilling at a nearby street under the guise of fixing a gas main. They hoped that this noise would cover up those of the technicians, but it served to only agitate the gunmen. So instead, Cobra organised planes on their way to and from London Heathrow Airport to fly over the embassy at a low altitude. On the morning of May 2nd, the third day of the siege, Mohammed came to the window and demanded that his group be allowed access to the telex system. He claimed that he would kill Abdul Fazi Izzati, the cultural attaché. The police refused to restore access to the telex system, however, and Abdul was pushed away from the window by Mohammed, who then demanded that he be allowed to speak with someone from the BBC who knew Sim Harris. Harris's boss, Tony Crabb, was then contacted by the authorities and brought to the scene. Mohammed once more demanded that he and his men be allowed safe passage from the UK, to be organised by 3 ambassadors from Arab countries, and that the media broadcast the group's statement detailing their grievances. Several embassies, including those of Algeria, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Qatar and Kuwait, were approached and asked if their ambassadors would be willing to speak with the hostages. While the ambassador for Jordan immediately declined, the others responded that they would need to speak with their governments. In the meantime, the BBC broadcast the group's statement, but Mohammed did not like the version that aired, considering it to have been severely shortened and incorrect. Later that day, the police spoke with the building's caretaker to get information about the building's security measures, which included a steel security door and armoured glass windows. Mohammed contacted the police at 6 AM the following day, feeling that the BBC had botched his and his men's statement. He subsequently alleged that the police had deceived him, and ordered the authorities to let him speak with an Arab ambassador. However, they were still waiting on the countries they'd approached to get back to them, and told Mohammed as such. Mohammed, for his part, believed that the British authorities were employing a delaying tactic, and responded by telling them that the British hostages would now be the last to be released, because they had lied to him. He then stated that he wanted to speak with Tony Crabb again, and threatened to kill a hostage unless his demands were met. Crabb, however, did not arrive until 10 hours later, something which frustrated not only Mohammed and his men, but also Sim Harris. Mohammed gave Crabb another statement, with the police agreeing to broadcast the message if 2 hostages were released. The hostages then decided amongst themselves who it was to be released. Later that night, one of the SAS teams discovered a skylight on the roof of the embassy. They then unlocked it should they need access to the building later, and attached ropes which would allow them to abseil down the building if necessary. The following day, on May 4th, further discussions with Arab countries took place, though little progress was made as the ambassadors wished to guarantee the men safe passage out of the UK, believing it was the only way to avoid violence and bloodshed. The British government, however, refused to entertain such a notion as they wanted the men apprehended. On May 5th, PC Locke was awoken by Mohammed and was convinced someone else was in the building with them, and had the officer examine a strange bulge in the wall. The wall had been weakened by the removal of bricks on the other side, should the SAS need to break through it, but Locke told Mohammed that he did not believe anyone was going to storm the building. Still suspicious, Mohammed separated the male hostages, placing them in a different room. The gunmen were tense and agitated throughout most of the day, and at 1 PM in the afternoon, Mohammed told the police that he wanted to speak with an Arab ambassador within 45 minutes, or else he would execute a hostage. 5 minutes before their time was up, Locke told the authorities that the embassy's chief press officer had been taken downstairs for execution. 3 shots rang out at 1:45 PM. Cobra subsequently ordered the SAS to gear up for an assault, even after learning that as many as 40% of the hostages could be killed during a raid. As the SAS got into position, police negotiators asked the Imam from Regent's Park Mosque to speak with the gunman. 3 more shots rang out during this conversation. Mohammed, more frustrated than ever, told the police that 1 hostage had died and that the rest would be killed in 30 minutes if they refused to meet his demands. Shortly afterwards, the body of the embassy's chief press officer, Abbas Lavasani, was thrown out of the front door. After his body was recovered, the SAS began their raid. 2 teams labelled Red Team and Blue Team conducted Operation Nimrod at 7:23 PM. 4 men from the Red Team abseiled down the roof at the back of the building. Meanwhile, another 4 men tossed a stun grenade through the unlocked skylight, which would go off in time with the explosives that the abseiling team was supposed to detonate. However, the action was delayed by 1 member becoming caught in his own rope. While a teammate helped him, they put their foot through a window, and the smashing of the glass immediately alerted Mohammed that something was going on. The SAS teams used sledgehammers instead of explosives to enter the building, but upon their entrance, a fire was started. The stranded soldier who'd been tangled in rope was eventually freed, and the blue team swept in to detonate explosives on the first floor window. Sim Harris had just entered the room and was forced to flee again, but he was eventually rescued outside of the building after being instructed to climb from one first-floor balcony to another, in full view of the police, journalists, and protesters below. Harris later recalled, quote, "They were throwing in grenades and the room was burning, so I had to crawl out onto the balcony and I was ready to jump actually. I thought, well, if I could get out of this with a broken leg, I would be alright." End quote. Locke, meanwhile, was now aware of the arrival of the SAS, and he tackled Mohammed to the ground to prevent his escape or an attack on the troops. In the ensuing tussle, Mohammed was shot dead by one of the SAS soldiers. Further teams were dispatched to clear out the ground floor and the cellar, while in a panic, the gunmen opened fire on the separated male captives. 2 men were injured, while another, Ali Akbar Samadzadeh, was killed. The SAS teams began evacuating the hostages, while 2 of the gunmen tried to escape by pretending to be captives. One was shot dead after being pushed to the bottom of a staircase after he pulled out a grenade. Ultimately, all but 1 of the gunmen were killed. The entire operation lasted a mere 17 minutes. Fauzi Badavi Najad was the only surviving gunman of the Iranian Embassy siege. Born in Khuzestan, he spent 2 years in the Iranian army before becoming a dock worker. In 1979, he witnessed an event known locally as Black Wednesday, where protesting Arabs were murdered by Iranian Revolutionary Guards. He subsequently fled to Iraq, where he was given asylum and, since he was bilingual and well-educated, he was given a job with Iraqi intelligence, where he translated Iranian radio broadcasts. He was shortly afterwards encouraged to take part in the siege by the Sheikh of Shalamcheh, who introduced himself as the chief of the political movement of Ahwazi Arabs, the largest Arab community in Khuzestan. On January 14, 1981, Najad appeared in court, having been charged with murder, conspiracy to murder, false imprisonment, and possessing firearms with intent. He pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty of the other charges. He then claimed during questioning that the plan had been made under the guidance of Iraqi authorities, and that he and the other gunmen had been incorrectly informed about the power and resources available to the British police and military. Journalist Mustafa Karkuti echoed similar statements, stating that the men seemed ill-prepared and badly misinformed about British authorities. Najad was convicted of all but the murder charges, and was given life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. He was known as Fozzie during his time behind bars, and was a withdrawn and quiet inmate who didn't cause trouble. He eventually wrote to some of his victims to apologize for the siege. In the early 2000s, new evidence came to light, including testimony from hostages who stated that Najad had repeatedly refused to kill, and thus had saved more lives than that of the other men, as well as information regarding what he'd been told about the siege before he'd participated. He'd reportedly been promised that a Jordanian ambassador would get involved before any violence was enacted. He was ultimately freed from prison in October 2008, having served 27 years. He was deemed to not be a threat to society and was allowed to remain in the UK. The Iranian government, meanwhile, were reportedly relieved to see the end of the siege, and claimed that the 2 hostages killed during the event were martyrs for the revolution. Just 4 months later, Iran was invaded by Iraq. The subsequent Iran-Iraq war lasted for 8 years and cost millions of lives. The Iranian Embassy was gutted in the fire following the raid, and was not reopened until 1993, 13 years later. In the decades which have passed since the siege, dozens of novels, TV programs, and films have been made regarding it, including factual retellings and fictional stories inspired by the events. Produced in 1983, there was even an Action Man figure who was made to resemble the SAS soldiers who had raided the building. Following the raid, which had been broadcast on live television by journalists outside the building, the SAS were thrust into the spotlight. While the SAS had once been viewed as a vague figure lingering on the outskirts of civilian knowledge, they were now widely regarded as talented problem solvers and heroes. The leader of the operation, Sir General Michael Rose, reportedly stated that the siege was the worst thing that had ever happened to the SAS, observing that the entire world now knew of their existence, which was at odds with the nature of the SAS, who were supposed to be covert specialist operatives living in the shadows.